Story 1. This happened a few days ago, and I still can't believe it. I'm a 25-year-old man, and I work at a garden nursery. It's a decent-sized place with a shop in the middle and outdoor plants on benches and racks around it, along with a parking area. One day, a lady in her 60s and her brother came in. They drove into our nursery, which has a driveway about 100 meters long, going through the plants. As the owner was walking along the driveway, they beeped at him, and the lady started yelling at him about selling her a dead tree that was supposed to sprout. I wasn't sure what she meant, but it definitely wasn't a great start. They parked and walked around for a bit. The brother approached me, asking all sorts of questions and demanding discounts on the plants. We don't offer discounts unless the plants are old. He then began interrogating me about my life and my job, and I just answered with simple yes and no responses without revealing too much. After I managed to shake him off, I walked through the nursery, checking to see if any plants needed watering. That's when the lady spotted me from about 80 meters away and started yelling. While this kind of thing happens occasionally, it's still pretty annoying to be called like a dog. Still, I thought she might have some difficulty walking, so I went over to her. The lady barely spoke English and was rambling something at me, so I kept asking her to repeat herself. Eventually, I figured out that she wanted to buy a tree. It was a large weeping cherry tree, about 2 meters tall, and including the pot, it was 2.5 meters. The pot alone held 90 liters of soil, making it incredibly heavy. I told her the price and walked her to the shop, asking if she'd like it delivered. We have a big truck for deliveries, which goes out once a week. Delivery isn't free, but the cost is reasonable, just enough to cover fuel and the driver's time. However, the lady declined and insisted, my car, pointing at her SUV. I thought there was no way the tree and its massive pot would fit, but I went along with it and processed the sale. I grabbed a tree trolley and brought the tree to her car. Her brother was sitting in the driver's seat, and she went and sat in the back seat. So, I asked her, "Where do you want me to put it?" She looked at me and said, "Put in your car. You come follow me." I was taken aback and asked, "What?" She repeated it, louder this time. I couldn't help but laugh and asked her again, "What are you talking about?" She just kept saying the same thing, louder and louder. I explained to her, "No, I'm not delivering this tree. You said you didn't want it delivered, and you didn't pay for delivery." She then said she didn't know there was a charge for delivery and asked how much it would cost. I asked her where she wanted it delivered, and she mentioned a suburb about 15 minutes away. I told her the price, and she responded, "Okay, follow me home, and I'll pay you then." I refused, explaining that's not how it works. I told her it would be delivered on Friday after she paid, and that she should come back inside the shop. After a lot more back and forth, with her yelling instructions at me and talking to her brother in another language, I placed the tree next to the shop. She continued yelling at me, insisting I follow her home and that she'd pay me there. By this point, I was done. I raised my voice to match hers and said, "I can't. My car can't fit that tree. Only the truck can, and I can't drive the truck. It's impossible for me to deliver it even if I wanted to, which I don't." After some more yelling, she finally seemed to understand that it wasn't going to happen. One strange thing I noticed was that neither she nor her brother would interact with any of the female staff. When I took her inside, the owners are a couple, was at the register, but the lady refused to speak to her. I explained the situation to the owner and said the lady needed to arrange for delivery before walking away. Just as I was about to leave, the lady shouted, "Excuse me." I turned around and snapped, "She will get your delivery details. She will help you." But instead of following up, the lady walked off and got back into her car. They started driving away without leaving any delivery payment, phone number, address, or even a name. I had to run out to their car to stop them. Even when I managed to get her address, it turned out to be non-existent when I checked on Google Maps. So, the lady had paid for a tree, but we had no way of delivering it. The next day, the brother called to ask about the delivery. It was Thursday, the day before deliveries. I had already told the work group chat what had happened, so everyone was aware in case these people came back. One of our female staff members answered the phone and explained everything I had told them, including the need for payment. The brother kept interrupting her and complaining. Frustrated, she eventually told him to go away and hung up on him. She thought we could refund their credit card and avoid dealing with them again. However, they had paid in cash, so another staff member had to call them back, smooth things over, and arrange for them to come in with a van to pick up the tree. I really hope they don't come back. Story 2. This is a story about my grandparents' friend. I was a young teen, but given the outcome, this story has stuck with me. I've sat on this story for a while, but it's so satisfying, so I figured I'd share. For the sake of this story, we will call my grandparents' friend William. Now, my grandparents knew William from way back. My grandmother knew him from school, and my grandfather met him after marrying my grandmother. Anyways, in the 60s, Grandma was a manager at 7-Eleven. William led a crew that went there every day. It was the only gas station in a 30-minute radius, so everyone knew everyone in that sleepy coastal town kind of way. Now, one day William was doing a job down on the waterfront and slipped, fell, and broke his back. While he was healing from the operation and was broke as a joke, my grandma would always make sure to send him something to eat that she'd pay for when the crew would come in to grab their snacks and gas up, knowing William would simply skip the meal to save the money for his own family. My grandpa also took him to several doctor appointments since William couldn't drive for a while and his tiny little wife couldn't wrangle him into a car by herself. William never forgot that. 20 years later, when he sold off his now very successful business and was a millionaire about 20 times over, he promptly told 90% of the world to go to hell, but kept those that had always been there for him close. Meanwhile, he never moved from the house that he'd had since before he was rich. His only concessions to his wealth were trips with his wife to see the world and buying up quite a few acres of the forested land around him. If you weren't his friend, you'd take him for every other blue-collar worker in the town. There was absolutely nothing obvious to show that he was worth tens of millions of dollars. After his wife died in the 90s, William decided to take up a new hobby. As he lived outside of the city limits, he set up a sawmill and woodworking shop, got all the proper permits and everything. The saws were in a big old enclosed building in the middle of all that land, so in all honesty, so no harm no foul, right? Wrong. The family that owned the forest behind William's land had just sold it to developers. Thus, the new luxury gated neighborhood, the first in the area, was born. Enter a plethora of Chads and Karens who were mostly from up north and had moved down south to take advantage of the better weather and the nearby beach. It didn't take long before they decided to take offense to his little business venture on the other side of the 10-foot-tall wall of their neighborhood because it didn't fit with the image of their community. You know, the community he was decidedly not a part of. So, they sued him. Didn't even try to start a dialogue with him, just up and sued him. William was livid. He was your typical coastal redneck, and he would be damned if those Yankees told him what to do on his own property that was not within city limits nor located in Anhoa. William countered with professional noise studies that showed that some of the kids in that neighborhood drove vehicles that made more ambient noise than his little operation. Nope, the people in the neighborhood simply threw more money at the lawyers to continue on with the lawsuit. Essentially, their plan was to bleed him dry. Their lawyers, who were not locals, actually told William's lawyer that he should probably advise his client to close the shop so that he wouldn't end up bankrupt due to the resources being thrown at him from the homeowners. Due to the relatively modest surroundings of his home, the neighbors nor their lawyers had any idea the man was actually richer than just about all of them put together. All they saw was an older dude who drove a beat-up 80s model truck and wore Dickies jeans and work shirts that lived in what appeared to be a relatively modest home, especially compared to their McMansions. When William's lawyer told him about that conversation, William lost his mind. I clearly remember him screeching into my parents' driveway in that old work truck, cussing up a storm and ranting and raving before he even got in the house. He came to our house. Why? because my grandmother, bless her heart, was known as one of the most giving people in the world, unless you got her angry. If you hurt her or someone she cared for, she became one of the most vindictive people that could be found in that town. I am not kidding when I say that her ability for revenge served cold was legendary amongst the locals. So William had come to the house for a dose of her deviousness. Us kids weren't allowed inside during that conversation, but after he left that day, I later heard the adults talking about how he proceeded to hire quite a few private investigators to see if there would be any dirt to dig up on them. By them, I mean the dozens of people in that neighborhood that were a part of that lawsuit. Lo and behold, there were apparently copious amounts of dirt to be had. I still remember him positively crowing about it to my grandparents one fine summer day months later. That 60-something-year-old man was as gleeful as the proverbial kid on Christmas morning. Why? Because after he learned what his little private army dug up, he started making some phone calls to various acquaintances in high places. The ensuing fallout meant that the lawsuit was dropped. There was quite a list of misdeeds that were discovered, but the ones that I heard talked about by the adults that stick out are: there were more than a handful of individuals that owed back child support. William very helpfully had the private investigators provide the mother's updated address and employment information so that they could pursue said child support garnishment if they wanted to. On top of that, the IRS became very interested in several of those people as well as various other neighbors. Finally, one household ended up in prison because the investigators realized that they were drug dealers. The pictures of the transactions caught by the pies were helpfully handed over to the sheriff's department. Drugs are bad, kids. Moral of the story: never get a rich redneck angry. Story 3. All the recent posts about entitled passengers wanting someone's seat reminded me of a bizarre encounter I had a few years ago. I was flying back from Toronto to Vancouver on a 787 aircraft, which offers these wonderful lie-flat pods in business class. The cabin was configured with a 1-2-1 setup, where the two middle seats are next to each other. However, this isn't a big deal if you're traveling alone, as there's a privacy slider you can use. I was flying solo and ended up in one of those middle seats. No problem. When I arrived at my seat, the woman on the other side was already seated. Here's how the conversation went. Entitled woman: "Hi there, would you mind switching seats with my husband so we can sit together?" Since the seats are identical, it didn't really matter to me where her husband was seated. It was either the same type of seat or perhaps one of the individual ones by the window, which would have been a nice upgrade, more privacy and space. Me: "Sure, no problem. Where's his seat?" Entitled woman: "Great, he's back there in 18B. I'll tell him to come up here. Thank you so much. Now, keep in mind, business class on this flight only has about 8 or 9 rows." Me: "Wait, 18B. Sorry, I'm not switching out of business class to the back of the plane." Entitled woman: "But you said you would. He's already on his way here." Me: "You can't seriously expect me to give up a lie-flat pod for a middle seat in economy. Are you joking?" At this point, I was genuinely looking around to see if I was being recorded. It felt like one of those prank videos on YouTube. Entitled woman: "It's not that big of a difference. Plus, it's in the bulkhead row, so there's plenty of legroom." After some back and forth trying to figure out how this even happened, it became clear that she and her husband had been seated in 18B and 18C. For some reason, she was offered a free upgrade to business class and accepted it, assuming that the person, me, in this case next to her, would simply swap seats with her husband. To make matters worse, seat 18C had been reassigned to someone else, so they couldn't sit together anymore. Me: "I'll tell you what, if you can find anyone else in business class to swap with your husband, I'll gladly take that seat, and you two can sit together. Anywhere in this cabin is fine with me, but I'm not moving back there." Entitled woman: "But we want to sit together up here." Me: "I'm sure you do, but I think you have 2 options, sit apart or sit together back in economy. I'm sure the person in 18C would love to take your seat up here. Why not go back and sit together in your original seats? With that, they both angrily headed back to economy. I half expected a new, confused person to show up, the lucky recipient of an instant upgrade. But no. She came back, visibly frustrated. Apparently, the person in 18A loved their bulkhead window seat and didn't want to move. The person in 18C was traveling with family in the 18F section and didn't want to swap either. Someone later mentioned that the flight attendants might have gotten involved and simply told her to go back to her assigned seat and stop trying to switch. Whatever the case, she eventually returned, making a big show of sitting down angrily, huffing and puffing. I couldn't have cared less. 30 minutes after takeoff, I was fully reclined and fast asleep for the rest of the flight. To this day, I'm still baffled that she thought this request made any sense at all. Story 4. My best friend and I had been planning this vacation for months. We'd saved up, requested time off work, and spent countless hours researching our destination. The night before our early morning flight, we were too excited to sleep. We arrived at the airport with plenty of time to spare. Security was a breeze, and we found ourselves with over an hour until boarding. My friend suggested we grab some food, as the flight only offered coffee service. "Let's get Burger King," I said, pointing to the familiar logo. "It'll be quick, and we can eat it before we board." We ordered our meals and sat down to enjoy them. As we ate, we chatted about our upcoming adventure. "Me, I can't believe we're finally doing this." "Friend, I know, right? It feels surreal." We finished most of our food, leaving just a few cold fries at the bottom of the bag. Soon after, it was time to board. We settled into our seats, stowed our carry-ons, and prepared for takeoff. About an hour into the flight, I noticed a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, running up and down the aisle. She seemed restless and bored. Suddenly, she stopped at our row and looked at us with big eyes. "Little girl, my mom said I can have my Burger King now." I was confused. We'd eaten our food before boarding, and all that remained were a few cold fries. My friend, always better with kids than me, spoke up. "Friend, oh, sweetie, we don't have any Burger King left. But would you like these fries?" She offered the bag with the remaining fries. The little girl's face scrunched up in anger. "Little girl, no, I want a cheeseburger." "Me, I'm sorry, but we don't have any cheeseburgers. We ate our food before getting on the plane." The girl's face turned red, and she stomped her foot. "Little girl, Mom, they won't give me any." With that, she ran back down the aisle. We exchanged confused looks, but shrugged it off. The rest of the flight was uneventful, and we didn't see the girl again. As we were preparing to disembark, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see a woman glaring at us. It was clear she was the little girl's mother. "Mother, you could have shared with a kid, you selfish bitches." I was shocked. How dare she speak to us like that? I felt my face flush with anger. "Me, excuse me? How dare you call us that? We didn't have any food left to share." The woman's eyes narrowed, and before I knew it, she lunged at me with her hands outstretched, nails ready to scratch. I stumbled backward, bumping into other passengers who were trying to get off the plane. "Flight attendant, ma'am, stop right there." A flight attendant rushed over, putting herself between us and the angry mother. "Flight attendant, what's going on here?" "Mother, these selfish women refused to share their food with my daughter." "Me, that's not true. We ate before boarding. We only had a few cold fries left, which we offered to her daughter." "Friend, we tried to explain, but the girl wanted a cheeseburger we didn't have." The flight attendant turned to the mother with a stern look. "Flight attendant, ma'am, it's not other passengers' responsibility to feed your child. If you needed food, you should have informed the cabin crew. Attempting to assault another passenger is a serious offense." The mother's face paled as she realized the trouble she was in. "Flight attendant, I'm going to have to ask you to remain on the plane. Airport security will escort you and your daughter off separately." As we finally exited the plane, I saw 2 security officers waiting in the jet bridge. The flight attendant explained the situation to them. Security officer, thank you for your patience. We'll take it from here. Enjoy your trip, and we apologize for this incident." My friend and I nodded gratefully and made our way to baggage claim. As we waited for our luggage, the adrenaline started to wear off. Friend, well, that was quite the start to our vacation, wasn't it? Me, you can say that again. At least we have an interesting story to tell when we get home. We laughed, grabbed our bags, and headed out to start our adventure, leaving the entitled mother and her daughter to face the consequences of their actions. It wasn't the beginning we'd expected, but it certainly made for a memorable start to our trip. Story 5. Not too long ago, I 23 posted in the Am I the Jerk subreddit asking for advice because my parents and sister were mad at me for regularly eating in a hospital cafeteria since it's close to my work. I enjoy the peace and quiet there on the days I go. But things escalated so radically that I still can't believe something this silly turned into such a mess. My sister did the pettiest thing she's ever done, and for completely unjustified reasons too. When my sister found out I was eating at the hospital cafeteria, she blew up, saying that food is for people who actually need to be at the hospital. We ended up in a huge argument, where I told her it wasn't like I was taking food away from patients. As usual, she ran to our parents to get them on her side. And just like I expected, they took her side, saying the hospital cafeteria isn't a place to casually eat. We got into a big argument over it, and they spent days hounding me, telling me I was wrong and demanding I stop going there. I went to Reddit for advice and learned that not only was I not doing anything wrong, but it's also a common thing for people to eat at hospital cafeterias because they like it. I hoped the situation would just die down, but a few days later, my sister called me, asking if I had stopped eating at the hospital. When I said no, it all started again. My parents called, fuming, as if I was supposed to stop just because they said so. I reminded them that I don't live under their roof anymore. And this kind of situation is exactly why I moved out in the first place. They always take my sister's side. This time, the fight didn't stay at home. My sister was so dead set on forcing me to stop that she told other relatives, trying to rally support. But our parents were the only ones on her side. My uncle even called my parents and sister to scold them, telling them they were only siding with her because she's their favorite, and that they're terrible parents for playing favorites. My cousin even went to eat with me at the hospital cafeteria and enjoyed it so much that he said he'd like to make it a regular thing. He works nearby and bikes everywhere, so it was convenient for him. We've run into each other at lunch there since. He liked that the food was healthier than most other places, and he's a picky eater. Of course, my sister got even angrier when she found out other family members were joining in. Once outnumbered, my parents finally backed down out of embarrassment. They apologized and gave me some nonsense about thinking it was weird to eat at a hospital. They claimed they felt like they had to defend my sister. I told them they've been catering to her for so long that taking her side is their default response whenever she starts something. My sister has been treating me like a condescending control freak since we were teenagers, even though I'm older, and they've always enabled her behavior. But I'm not putting up with it anymore. My parents finally conceded and made my sister apologize too, though she clearly hated every second of it. She tried to speak through her teeth at first. Later, my parents invited me to dinner as another form of apology. But it felt more like a show for the rest of the family because they told everyone about it before it even happened. The dinner itself was great, I can't deny that. They cooked turkey, which is one of my favorite dishes. I love the drumsticks smothered in gravy. I'm a bit of a pig when I eat them, but I can't help it. My sister has always thought it was hilarious, and it's one of the few things I don't mind her laughing about. So, I didn't think anything of it when she was giggling during dinner. After dinner, I noticed my bicycle was missing. I had parked it in the backyard, out of sight, but it was gone. I panicked because it's my only mode of transportation. My parents were concerned, but my sister seemed the opposite. She looked pleased and kept giggling. I immediately suspected her, but she played innocent, acting like she couldn't believe I would accuse her of something like that. Knowing how petty she is, I didn't believe her. I told her I was going to the neighbor's house to check their security cameras and call the police. That's when my sister's expression changed, and I knew she was involved. I got angry and demanded my bike back, but she started crying, claiming she didn't do anything. And of course, my parents immediately took her side, scolding me for accusing her. I'd had enough. I told them I was going to the neighbors to check the cameras and call the police. As soon as I said that, my sister panicked and called me back. The looks on my parents' faces after they had just defended her were priceless. My sister admitted that she was so angry about having to apologize for something she still believed she was right about that she had a couple of her friends come and steal my bike during dinner. They took it in a minivan and parked it just down the street. She then started crying again, saying I couldn't call the police because I'm her older brother. My parents backed her up, but I wasn't having it. I started walking outside again, and they all ran after me, with my sister begging me to stop. I called her a brat and told my parents I couldn't believe they were still defending her after this. Finally, my parents reached their breaking point and told my sister to call her friends and have them bring the bike back immediately. She called them while sniffling, then ran into her room to whisper. A little over an hour later, her friends arrived with my bike, but it was a complete mess, soaked and covered in mud, like it had been dragged through a ditch. My sister admitted that her friends had tried to dump it in a pond a few miles away but went back to get it when they realized they were caught. When her friends arrived, they were muddy up to their knees and begged me not to report them to the police. I recorded them admitting that my sister had asked them to dispose of the bike. I wasn't surprised and made sure they told my parents what happened too. My sister broke down in tears again, throwing a tantrum on the floor like a toddler. It was embarrassing to watch her act this way as an adult. My parents banned her friends from the house and forced my sister to apologize again. Our father made her wash and oil my bike under his supervision, while I took apart the headlight to clean it out. By the time she was done, it was dark outside. She glared at me like I was the villain, but my parents shut her attitude down, saying they've never been more embarrassed by her behavior. Afterward, I had a serious conversation with my parents. I told them that my sister's childish behavior was a direct result of their constant enabling. She's still mentally a child because they've never held her accountable for anything. They've always made me the scapegoat whenever she messes up, so she has no sense of responsibility. For once, they didn't argue with me. My father quietly drove me and my bike back to my apartment in his SUV and gave me some money to replace my missing water bottle. Since then, my sister's friends have been sending me angry messages, blaming me for making her cry over what they call a harmless prank. I'm sure my sister told them a completely different version of events. I texted back explaining what really happened and mentioned that I have recordings of her friends admitting everything. Somehow, the truth got out at my sister's college. Maybe it was through my text, or maybe her friends spilled the beans, but people started calling her and her friends thieves. It embarrassed her so much that she came home in tears, complaining that people were joking about not leaving their bikes around her. She refused to leave her room for 3 days, throwing a pity party for herself. My parents tried to blame me again, calling to ask if I could make things easier for her. I reminded them of our conversation and told them they needed to let her deal with the consequences of her own actions. They seemed defeated and apologized before hanging up. Clearly, they were hoping I would take the blame just to make my sister feel better, but I'm done with that. Now my parents are trying to pretend none of this ever happened, and my sister and her friends are avoiding me. Honestly, that's fine with me. I don't want any more drama. But if something like this happens again, I won't take it quietly. Story 6. I have a cousin. He is one of the most terrible people I have ever known, selfish, dishonest, bad temper, you name it. Some years ago, my cousin was manipulating my aging grandmother and mooching off of her. He had her convinced that he was her son and his kids were her grandkids. My grandmother was starting to suffer from dementia at the time, but was still able to take care of herself. My mother figured out what he was doing and was having none of it. My mother attempted to confront him about it one day at my grandmother's house when he was dropping off his 3 kids for free childcare so he could go do whatever he wanted. He started shouting at my mother and threatening her in the driveway. My mom's dog didn't like this and started barking at him. He started screaming at my mom to get her vicious dog away from his children, that if her dog bit them, he'd sue her, etc., etc. My mom turned to grab her dog's collar and put the dog back in the truck. But while my mom, who is disabled and in her late 50s at the time, had her back turned, and he sucker punched her as hard as he could, knocking her down and breaking her collarbone. Mom knew she was hurt, came up off the ground and told him she'd call the cops and press charges on him. My grandmother, who you must remember was not exactly in her right mind anymore, but hadn't been diagnosed yet, then screamed at my mother not to cause drama, and if she pressed charges on my cousin that my grandmother would disown her. My mom went to the doctor, confirmed the broken collarbone. The doctor was smart, told her that if a person had done this to her, she could press abuse or assault charges. My mom didn't want to make a fuss. That's when I took over. Fine. If he was going to play dirty, I'd play dirty too. I knew that my cousin had been completely wrecking the house he was living in. He was often late with rent and the place was falling apart. He had 3 kids full-time and a kid from his first marriage who was there on weekends. I knew that the smaller kids often went to school dirty and in ripped clothes and were constantly sick. The sick children often got my grandmother sick too. With this knowledge in mind, I called CPS. I'm pretty good at imitating different accents. I knew the call would be recorded, so I disguised my voice and reported that I was scared for those poor children. That I'd seen how dirty they were, how his house was overrun with pets, and I had heard him screaming at the children, and was worried that he was being abusive to them. Turns out, I was more right than I knew. Also, apparently, his actual neighbors had been calling CPS about him too. My call tipped the scales. The next day, CPS agents rolled up early in the morning for a surprise inspection. The younger kids were in dirty beds with no proper blankets. There were holes in the floor, bare electrical outlets, cats and cat feces everywhere, trash and debris everywhere. Apparently it was so disgusting there that CPS took the kids out to their van and gave him 30 minutes to contact a relative who could safely house them. My aunt came and took the kids to her house. My cousin was given an order, 30 days to get the house in proper shape, clean and safe for children. Their needs must be visibly met, etc., or his children would be taken away and placed in foster care. He was furious. His wife was furious. They barely managed to get the place fixed in time. I heard about him complaining about some out-of-state nosy jerk called Child Services on me, if I ever find out who that jerk was. Blah blah. I just sat back and laughed. That's what you get for messing with my mom, boy. His name was red flagged for the next several years, and the slightest complaint was investigated immediately. His wife, mother of the 3 who were nearly taken, started hounding him constantly about keeping the house clean because she was the one working to support them. His temper just got worse, and at one point he assaulted his eldest child. His ex-wife pressed charges of child abuse, and he got put in jail for a few days. My dementia-ridden grandmother bailed him out. This got him red-flagged even more, and the police made him surrender all his hunting rifles and handguns. Any time after that, when my grandmother would get sick from some nastiness his kids gave her, I had fun picking up the phone. Because of the red flags, prior arrest for assault and etc., Child Services stayed on him on a monthly basis. His wife eventually got so tired of CPS constantly coming around trying to take her kids away that she left him and took the kids with her to a different town. When my grandmother passed away, cousin started some nasty drama with my mom again. He threatened her, locked her out of my grandmother's house, which she had inherited in the will, so he could hold it over her head and try to get her to give him more money. Turns out his temper had gotten him in trouble, and he'd had his right to bear arms taken away. He inherited some guns from my grandparents in the wills. Oops, guess how the cops found out he had guns in his possession. Yep, that was me. Again, I've also gotten him kicked out of Facebook trading groups, signed him up for newsletters, and generally any other petty thing I could think of. My mom now has a restraining order against him, and we haven't seen him in over a year. Last I heard, though, his middle child had run away from home. His second ex-wife has moved with the two youngest back to her home state, and he's got nothing since he blew through his inheritance money in less than a year. Just writing this makes me smile all over again.